It is the new boss type introduced in Medarot S, whose name literally means eight-headed giant snake with a motif of the Yamata no Orochi. It is YMT00 Yatsukubi Daija, with a kit of Hyper Tornado, Mud Shot, Hyper Thunder Shot, multi-legs, and the leg ability of Blowbeat, which ignores a percentage of the target's resist stats when attacking. Now, the story behind Yatsukubi Daija is a rather interesting one, as for those that are uninvolved or unaware, it was actually part of a reveal contest held on Twitter where Medarot Hotori was actually working on trying to restore some broken parts she found, and we were essentially drip revealed pieces of it one at a time. But with it officially introduced in the game a couple of weeks ago as an official boss type bot, we now officially have a full-scale kit, as well as just how dangerous it can be on the field. Hyper Tornado on the head part is basically just a much stronger version of standard Tornado with pierce damage, but of course with the drawback that you cannot dodge or defend while in cooldown. But, to explain Hyper Tornado briefly, upon attacking the target successfully, it will effectively sweep them up in the air off their feet, as well as cancel any guard effects and render them entirely stunned and stalled in their position for a short amount of time. However, it is also worth noting that Tornado also temporarily implants anti-air weakness on that target. So that means it is made immensely powerful and especially useful to anyone that is making use of anti-air spam in competitive meta, which currently is the really big push that everyone is going for. Mud Shot on the right arm is a brand new skill being introduced to the game, and boy oh boy is it a nasty one. Not only does it debuff the target's mobility and evade by 20%, making them very notably slower than they were before, but it also converts the target's leg type. And I will say that again for clarification, it changes their leg type to C-based for however long that ailment lasts. This can be made especially deadly for a number of reasons. The first of which is the very obvious changing of the leg type to C. This means that basically, while with this temporary weakness implanted, that does make them susceptible to any anti-C weakness. So now we effectively have a Tornado equivalent for anti-C base to be made competitively meta. Not just that, the speed and mobility and evade debuffs also are very deadly for a number of reasons in a game of speed, but it is much more so deadly for a third reason specifically, and it is the first ever instance ever in this game's history, and essentially in any game in Medarot history, if I like to believe correctly, where it changes the opponent's leg type outright. Prior to this, we've only had changing terrain or negating compatibility on certain terrains, but not outright forcefully changing the leg type. And this is dangerous primarily for the fact that if the metal that they're using is not compatible with a C-based leg, that not only cuts down their mobility by the 20% they already have, minus, or rather in addition to the poor terrain bonus they would get with C legs, but now they are now slowed down to an absolute, total, unequivocal crawl. Because now their metal doesn't know what to do with this change to C legs because it doesn't have compatibility with it. Which means if used correctly, this will slow everyone on the field down to an absolute crawl, uncontested, period. The left arm of Hyper Thundershot is a relatively new skill that we have seen just start to pop its head more and more recently, but explaining it, it's basically Thundershot but with an extra kick to it. Now, much like with Hyper Tornado, it does have added damage, but it has a much higher base damage and pierce damage at the cost of being unable to dodge or defend while in cooldown. But Thundershot, or Hyper Thundershot in this case, is very good for stalling enemy targets to buy yourself just a little bit extra time so that you can stall that particularly deadly foe, or kind of build them into a 2-turn stun lock by going with this first, and then following up with, say, Bug or Virus to force turn skip on them if you manage to outrun them. Multi-legs means that Yatsukubi Daija will have a very solid mobility across most terrains, as multi-legs tend to have the next best terrain matching and stat spread just under Biped in terms of diversity in what it brings to the table. And when it comes to stat spread, it is chunky, it is heavy, and it is rather aggressive with what it brings to the field as well. with a total head HP of about 4,400 there, each arm about 4,100 apiece, and the legs at 4,450. Very healthy HP pool there for this very powerful Yamata no Orochi type. And the leg ability of Blowbeat does also give it a little extra aggressiveness as well, as it means that not only will it be dealing notably higher damage than the standard tornado or thunder shot that you'd expect, but it also will be dealing just a little bit more damage on top of that because it's ignoring a percentage of the enemy's legs resist stats when attacking them. Now, when it comes to leg stats across the board, it is honestly a pretty solid leg, as expected of a boss-type bot, essentially. With a mobility of 841, off to a very good start with multi-legs. An evade of 737 isn't all that great, but a very heavy, chunky bot like this one really isn't going to be focusing on dodging or grazing all too much, which kind of hurts it to a point, given that 2 of its moves render it unable to dodge or defend, which means if it's caught afterwards in its cooldown, it's gonna be really hurting from those. However, with a melee resist of 1136 and a shoot resist of 1607, it most certainly does make up for this with some higher than average damage reduction stats to keep the damage as low as possible, where it is able to dodge or graze or even defend against attacks, keep the damage as low as possible. All this being said though, as a pure set score, I still do have to rate him a pretty solid 6.5 out of 10. Not to say that's a bad kit or it's very poorly or has a very poor synergy with each other, but it's very obvious from its kit that it's not designed as a nuker. Well, that's partially correct. It's designed as a very aggressive ailment nuker, I should correct myself to, because it does have some very superb base damage at 1427 on the Hyper Tornado, 1147 on Mudshot, almost a little over 1650 there for Hyper Thundershot as well, so it definitely has the power, and Blowbeat does definitely help comp that as well. But it does have a lot of open weaknesses that are very easy to exploit. That being said, of course, if you are using Stat Cleanse, this can keep him off your tail, unintended, just for a couple extra turns as long as you can keep that up going. But it does also have a number of notable weaknesses. The inability to dodge or defend on 2 skills is one of them, but it is also worth noting that he is triple heavy. That means if you are bringing any gravity attribute skills such as press, break, break hammer, break rush, and so on, this will absolutely cut this very powerful Hydra type down to size a lot quicker than what he would intend to. As mixed parts though, I have to rate him notably higher at an 8 out of 10, given that his legs are very notably good across the board in the stats that they have. Blowbeat is a very good skill that can tally on both shooting or melee attacks very easily, and Mudshot is probably going to be the very big go-to part that you definitely do not want to miss on him, primarily for the fact that it slows enemies to a crawl on 3 different fronts, 3 ideally, but 2 mostly, between the debuff mobility and the changing of the leg type to C with terrain matching, but it's also going to give a massive rise to anti-C competitive viability in the meta. So I'm very much so looking forward to seeing that rise, and I'm expecting it, honestly, with a lot of people going for this Yamata no Orochi type. Even if it's just for one part, or even if it's for the pure set, it is still a very powerful model and a force to be reckoned with, whether it's on the ally side or on the enemy side.